Welcome back to Verbal Sparring. In today's video, I'm going to give my 2026 UFC wish list. I came up with 10 different ideas that I either do or don't want to see happen for the Ultimate Fighting Championship this year. So we're going to jump into all of those ideas right here, right now, and then at the end of the video, I want you to let me know down in the comments if you agree with me and if you have some other wishes for the UFC this year. So number one on my wish list, and I just want to preface that these are not in any particular order, they're just in the order that I put them down on my Google Doc. There's not one that's more important than the other. And that first one is, I would like to see at least 2 title fights for every UFC division in 2026. And so by doing quick math, there are 11 weight classes in the UFC, times 2, that would be 22 championship fights. I'm not asking for much. Now, for the flyweight division, we did see 2 on the dot. We saw Alexandre Pantoja defend his title against Kai France in June, and then he would fight Joshua Van at the last pay-per-view of the year, where Van would become the new champion due to Pantoja's injury. And there was one division that even doubled this request, and that was the bantamweight division, thanks to Murad Dvalishvili, who competed in 4 championship bouts in 2025 with 3 successful defenses, and then he would lose his title to Petr Yan in their rematch. But as we continue to move up the weight classes and even into the women's weight classes, that is where things are going to change a little bit. For the featherweight division, there was only 1 championship fight, as we would see Ilia Topuria vacate his title in the first few months of 2025, and then the vacated title fight would happen between Alexander Volkanovski and Diego Lopez in April at UFC 314, and there was not another championship bout from Volk since. In the lightweight division, there were exactly 2 championship fights. UFC 311, Islam Makhachev would defeat Renato Moicano on a day's notice, and then he would vacate his title in the summertime. Ilia Topuria would move up to 155 pounds and fight for the vacant title against Charles Oliveira, and he would become a 2-weight world champion. There were also 2 in the welterweight division, so far we've hit in 4 out of 5 weight classes. UFC 315, we would see Belal Muhammad take on Jack Della Maddalena, and then at UFC 322, Jack Della Maddalena defended his title against the aforementioned Islam Makhachev, who vacated his lightweight title to move up to 170 pounds. Keep that vacated word in your brain, it's going to come up again in this video. At middleweight, we also saw 2 championship bouts. Dricus du Plessis fought in February at UFC 312 against Sean Strickland in their rematch, and then would attempt to defend his title again against Khamzat Chimaev in August at UFC 319. However, Chimaev would become the new champion of the world. At light heavyweight, there were also exactly 2 championship fights, as Alex Pereira and Magomed Ankalaev would fight twice. Their first fight was at UFC 313 with Pereira entering as the champion and Ankalaev leaving as the champion, and then they would fight again at UFC 320 in October with Pereira leaving as the champion, even though Magomed Ankalaev entered as the champ. And then there's the dreaded heavyweight division. Oh, this was just the worst division of all of 2025 if you ask me for the UFC, and that's saying a lot considering women's bantamweight isn't doing itself any favors the last few years. And that lone heavyweight title fight would come in October at UFC 321, and so finally we were going to see Tom Aspinall in action, and even though it wasn't against John Jones, he was going to be taking on Ciryl Gane, the former interim champion, and it was going to be a great heavyweight fight, at least if the first 4.5 minutes had any indication. However, the fight would be stopped due to an illegal eye poke from Ciryl Gane and ruled a no contest, and that was the only heavyweight fight that was for the championship all year, and it fell flat on its face. And as for the 3 women's weight classes, 2 of those 3 did have 2 championship bouts. The strawweight division, where we would see Zhang Weili take on Tatiana Suarez at UFC 312, and then the vacant title fight between Mackenzie Dern and Virna Jandiroba at UFC 321. The flyweight title would also have 2 on the dot, as Valentina Shevchenko would fight in May at UFC 315 against Manon Fiorot, and then she would fight at UFC 322 against Zhang Weili, who vacated the strawweight title. And then the women's weight class that did not meet the requirement of 2 championship fights would have been women's bantamweight, as we only saw 1, and that was in June at UFC 316, where Kayla Harrison would dethrone Juliana Pena. So all in all, I'm not making that outlandish of a request here of the UFC and its champions, because 8 of the 11 divisions did meet the 2 title fight minimum in 2025. Now I'm just looking for 3 extras to join them in 2026 and go 11 for 11. Next up, number 2 on the list of 10 is that I would like to see less than 10 10 Apex fight cards, meaning that anything 9 and under will get the check mark. Of the 42 events that would happen in 2025, 11 of them happened at the Apex for a Fight Night card. And those would run from UFC Vegas 101 in January, the first card of the entire year, headlined by Mackenzie Dern and Amanda Hebos, all the way through UFC Vegas 112, the final card of the year, that would be headlined by Manel Kape and Brandon Royval. So in order to meet this wish, we need 2 less Apex fight cards on the books in 2026. However, we have some of the calendar already announced, and we might be trending in the wrong direction. So far, there are 9 events confirmed for the 2026 calendar for the UFC, ranging from January 24th to March 28th, and of those 9, 2 of them are indeed fight nights at the Apex. One is on February 7th, that is going to be headlined by Mario Bautista and Vinicius Oliveira, and the other will happen on March 14th, but a headliner has yet to be determined. And in total this year, we will be getting 43 events for the UFC and the Paramount Plus's first debut year together. 13 of them will be numbered events like UFC 324 and UFC 325, which means that we will see 30 fight night events. And so by doing some real quick and crazy math, 6 of these first 9 events that have been announced are fight nights, and 2 of the 6 are at the Apex. 2 divided by 6 is 33%. So over the course of 30 fight night cards, 33% is more than 10. See what I mean? We're trending in the wrong direction. We need some more fight nights announced soon that will not be at the warehouse in the desert. Number 3 on the UFC 2026 wish list is that I would like to see at least one title fight happen on a fight night card, specifically if that fight night is in the location where the champion is from. That last bit is just a little bit of an extra push, but the main goal was to have a title fight on a fight night card. The main reasoning for this is that we are simply no longer on a strict title fight on a pay-per-view only regimen. So while yes, the numbered cards like UFC 324 and UFC 325 are still going to be the bigger events and will have the biggest names and will have those big important title fights, we can still have 1 or 2 championships be defended on a fight night card that's on the road traveling to a crowd rather than in the Apex. Lord forbid we have an Apex fight night card and a title fight in 2026. We are really downhill if that happens. And the fact of the matter is that we have not seen a title fight on a fight night card for the UFC since 2020, where we did see it in 2 different instances, but they were between the same 2 men. In February, Deiveson Figueiredo and Joseph Benavidez were competing for the vacant title after Henry Cejudo moved up to bantamweight and would subsequently retire later on in the year after defeating Dominic Cruz. So we needed a new 125-pound king. In that fight in February, Deiveson Figueiredo would defeat Joseph Benavidez. However, Figueiredo missed weight, so he was ineligible to become the champion on that night, so the UFC would simply run the fight back a couple of months later in July. This time, both fighters successfully made weight. Deiveson Figueiredo would earn a vicious finish win over Benavidez and become the flyweight champion of the world. And prior to that, we also saw it happen 2 times in 2019, and they were 3 weeks apart from one another in August, as we would see Valentina Shevchenko take on Liz Carmouche at a fight night on August 10th of 2019, and that title fight took place in Uruguay. And then 3 weeks later, on August 31st, we saw Jessica Andrade and Zhang Weili fight for the strawweight championship in China, and Zhang Weili would become the first ever Chinese-born champion in UFC history by knocking out Andrade in the first round. So we went all of 2021, 2022, 2023, 2024, and 2025 without any championship bouts on a fight night card. I think it's time to bring that back into the fold in 2026. And number 4 and number 5, the next 2 wishes that I'm going to discuss kind of tie hand in hand, so I'm just going to kind of stick them together here. Number 4, no vacant titles, and number 5, no interim title fights. In 2025, we saw Ilia Topuria vacate his featherweight title, Islam Makhachev vacate his lightweight title, and Zhang Weili vacate her strawweight title. And if you want to get technical, we also saw a 4th vacant title, and that was because John Jones decided to retire over the course of the summer, and so Tom Aspinall, who was the interim champion with an interim title defense, would just be upgraded to the undisputed champion. Now, outside of the heavyweight division, the other vacated titles didn't necessarily leave their divisions up in limbo, as the UFC was able to put together vacant title fights rather quickly. Volkanovski versus Lopez for the vacated title, Topuria versus Oliveira for the vacated title at lightweight, and Dern versus Jandiroba in Zhang Weili's strawweight absence. But what is likely to happen specifically in the strawweight division, being that Zhang Weili was unsuccessful in her attempt to become the flyweight champion, is that she's just going to come back down to strawweight and get an immediate shot at her once held title, or twice held, I guess I should say. And the trickle down effect of that is that the rest of the title contenders kind of just get pushed to the wayside. Not that there's that many in the strawweight division, but you at least see where it could cause issues in other weight classes. Now, as for the interim title fights, I kind of cheated, so pump the brakes. You're probably already thinking that I was wrong, but technically the interim title fight at UFC 324 was announced in 2025. Yes, it's happening in 2026, but give me a break on this one. After UFC 324, where we see Justin Gaethje and Paddy Pimblett square off for the interim lightweight title, I do not want to see any more interim fights throughout the remainder of the year. Now, there is one weight class that is really scaring me for both the interim title fights and the vacated title fights, and that is the heavyweight division, because Tom Aspinall is about to have his second eye surgery this month, and we have no timetable on his return. So if he can't fight before the end of 2026, it's possible that the UFC will either slap an interim heavyweight title fight on a pay-per-view later this year, or they will make Tom Aspinall vacate the title, and then I'll be in trouble because one of these two is going to absolutely be guaranteed to lose. So please, Tom, recover swiftly and come back before the summertime. Now we move to the second half of the wish list. Sitting at number 6, I would like to see at least 100 women's fights in the UFC this year. If you are new to the channel, I have a video breaking down the UFC by the numbers in 2025. You should check that out if you haven't. And in that video, I talked about how many fights happened in each individual weight class, and the grand total for all three women's divisions was only 77 fights, with 20 bantamweight fights, 24 flyweight, and 33 at strawweight. And that only accounted for 14.8% of all UFC fights in 2025, as their male counterparts had 443 fights for 85.2%. Now, of course, I understand there's 8 men's weight classes versus only 3 for the women, but there absolutely should be many more than 77 fights with a 14% share of the total. Especially when you consider just how good the women's flyweight and strawweight divisions are. They are loaded right now with talent from top to bottom, with seasoned veterans and young up-and-coming prospects and everything in between. Now, the women's bantamweight division, not so much, but there are at least some bright prospects to keep our eyes on in 2026. And I just felt like in 2025, most of the women's bantamweight fights that did happen didn't feature ranked fighters. A lot of them did not fight, and if they did, it was only once. And there are already some big women's fights on the books for 2026. The title fight between Kayla Harrison and Amanda Nunes, a big fight, one of the biggest in women's mixed martial arts history. On that very same card, we're seeing Rose Namajunas versus Natalia Silva in what is more than likely going to be a title eliminator for Valentina Shevchenko's throne. And so hopefully we can take that momentum of the first card of the year and spread it to the rest of the 11 months and bring us into triple digits for women's MMA this year. Next up, I would like to see the UFC do something that it also did in 2025, and that is 1, travel to a new location, and 2, travel to a location that they haven't been in a long time. Last year, the UFC held events in Doha, Qatar, and Baku, Azerbaijan, both countries that the UFC had never been in its 30-plus year history, so it checked the box there, and it also made returns to cities such as Seattle, Washington, and Chicago, Illinois. Now, on the books so far through the first 9 events, there's not any of those boxes checked off, as they are going to Vegas, they're going back to Seattle for the second consecutive year, back to London as they do every year. Houston, Texas is almost in that category, but they've had a few more events in some of the other big cities in the United States. Oh, and I guess another fun one to mention that happened last year in May was Des Moines, Iowa. That one came out of nowhere. We need something like that in 2026. And as for countries that the UFC could target, we know that they have their eyes on Africa. I don't know if this is going to be the year that they visit that continent and which country they will choose if they choose to go there. And we know that they'll probably make some trips back to Saudi Arabia and Abu Dhabi, so I'll be curious to see if they have any other countries on the docket that they have never been before. Dana seems to always get questions about European countries as well in post-fight press conferences, so we're going to keep our eyes on that schedule as the year progresses. Next up, I would like to see at least 3 ranked fights for every fight night card. And I think that this is doable because similarly earlier to how I said I want to see a title fight happen at least once on a fight night card, the same can be said here. Why can't we see at least 3 ranked matchups on 30 different fight night cards? There's 11 weight classes with at least 15 ranked fighters in each and every one of them, and we don't have to hold the biggest name or best fighters in the world back behind a pay-per-view wall anymore. We can have more big name fighters and ranked matchups happen on fight night cards, yes, in the Apex, but also when the UFC is traveling to have fans in the stands. Essentially, I want more fight nights to look how it did in Qatar, for example. You had Saryukian versus Hooker, a main event that was arguably a number one contender fight. Ian Gary and Bilal Muhammad, another number one contender fight. Volkan Oezdemir and Minifield. Waldo Cortez Acosta and Shamil Gaziev. Kyoji Horiguchi and Tagir Ulanbekov. I mean, that's 5 ranked fights right there on a fight night card. Yes, they held it for one where they were traveling to, but I think now, even if we do get 9, hopefully, or less Apex events, those 9 can still feature at least 3 ranked matchups on the card to have more intrigue for fight fans on a week-by-week basis. Next up, I'm going specifically to a fighter, and it's a retired fighter and former champion, UFC Hall of Famer, and a legend of women's mixed martial arts. That is Ronda Rousey. If she does return in 2026, like Ariel Helwani and many outlets have alluded to being a possibility, UFC, do not give Ronda Rousey a title fight in her return bout. When she fought Amanda Nunes, it was at least semi-justified. She was the greatest fighter that we had ever seen in the UFC up to that point. She was one of the biggest stars that the company has ever had, and she was on a hiatus that was nowhere near as long as it is now, nearly 10 years in the making. And part of me just has a feeling that the UFC is going to want to bring Ronda Rousey back for that White House card and take on the winner of Kayla Harrison and Amanda Nunes, and I just do not want to see that happen. Not a single % of me wants that fight. Now, if you want to bring Ronda Rousey back for a fun trilogy bout with someone like a Miesha Tate on the White House card, I can get down for that 10 times out of 10. But she cannot come back to the UFC after nearly 10 years away into a title fight. 1, it makes absolutely no sense and is not fair to anyone in the bantamweight division, and 2, she will get absolutely mollywopped by either Kayla Harrison or Amanda Nunes. And lastly, throughout the year, as we go through 43 events in 2026, I would like at least 4 or 5 opportunities to see a number one contender bout label be put onto a fight and take place on the same night as the title in their respective division will be getting defended. Hopefully that didn't sound like word vomit and I explained that well, but think back to UFC 322. We saw the welterweight championship going down between Jack Della Maddalena and Islam Makhachev, and lower on the card, we saw 2 potential number one contender fights, Michael Morales and Sean Brady, and Leon Edwards and Carlos Prades. Another quick one to think about off the dome is back at UFC 317 in June, where we saw Brandon Royval and Joshua Van competing on the featured bout, and later on the card we saw Alexandre Pantoja and Kai Kara France fight for the title, and then we would see Pantoja get to square off and face off with Brandon Royval, who won on the very same night, and that set up their December title fight. I think it adds a little bit more stake and storylines to each of those big events that happen when you have a number one contender fight happening on the same card as the title. And then when you take into account that you can have the winner square off at the end of the night with the champion, whoever stood tall at the end of the night, looking and facing whoever their next opponent is going to be who competed and got a big win earlier on the card, I think that is definitely something that we can see happen at least 5 times this year. The divisions are just so stacked right now, a lot of them. So that is it for my UFC 2026 wish list, all 10 items, and I want to get your thoughts on those down in the comments below. If you agree with them, if you don't like any of them, and also what some of your wishes are for the UFC this year as well. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new, because we are inching closer and closer by the day to that milestone of 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, so any and all support is greatly appreciated. You can also join the community on social media at Verbal Spar MMA on X, Instagram, and TikTok, as well as like the Facebook page Verbal Sparring MMA, and you can follow on your favorite audio listening platform such as Spotify and Apple, where during peak fight season, podcast episodes release there every Monday and Friday. Have a great week, and I will see you all in the next video.